The late 80s were a thriving period for thrash. The steely melodic precision of British heavy metal and the untempered rage of hardcore punk fused into a musical style that was abrasive but never boring. And as the decade passed, the pioneers of this genre sought to push it to its limits. This era, circa 1986 to 1990, saw some of the most technical and intense musicianship the genre would ever know, right before metal largely retreated back to its early Sabbath influences. Albums like Rain and Blood, The Legacy, Among the Living, Punishment for Decadence, Beneath the Remains, Alice in Hell, By Inheritance, and Rust in Peace. All albums that flexed the musicianship these bands had garnered after years of honing their craft. But there's one album I've yet to mention, an album that was not only cutting edge, but also unique in a circle of thrash albums at the forefront of their genre. I'm talking, of course, about And Justice for All. The mythology around this album is well known to metal, for better or worse. A change in style birthed from tragic loss that marked the end of thrash's golden age. It makes for a good story, and that's all it is, a story. Because if you recall, this trend wasn't limited to Metallica. It was a natural progression of thrash as a genre that even the band itself has acknowledged. And I'm not interested in talking about the story of this album. That's been done to death. No, I want to talk about why it's amazing in a way that can never be replicated. Metallica's idea of what intensity could mean for thrash was very different from what it appears it attempted. Far from just faster songs or excessive time signature wankery, Metallica used every tool in their box to create a mood of intensity and desolation. Well, almost every tool.
Yes, we'll get to that.
Blackened's main riff and verse are a perfect crystallization of Metallica's impressive songwriting on this album, how they could escape common time while not being overbearing. The main riff is in 7/4, which is a very odd time, but what makes it so amazing is that it doesn't feel like an odd time. There's no jagged edges here. This is what I mean by how Metallica avoids excess. If they have an odd time, it's because it works for that part of the song better than common time would. If a riff sounded cool, they would use it, and the real composing part comes from trying to make all these pieces fit together.
And we had so many riffs that we wanted to get them all in. So we were jamming riffs in there, forcing them in. When you talk about kind of the craziness of frayed ends or something, that all of a sudden it goes over this way, and trying to outdo ourselves that way. How many riffs can we get in one song?
The result of that style of songwriting is that Blackened almost sounds wrong in common time, not just in the main riff, but all over the song. And it's a good point of reference that one can use to make their own riffs sound good. And speaking of what sounds good, let's talk about those solos, yeah? There's a lot to choose from, but I think one does the best job of showcasing how great they are. Early Metallica solos were good, no, great, but the most they ever did to be on lock with the other instruments was to just follow whatever key the rhythm section was in. As I said, that's not bad, but when you compare them to the solo in the Machine Gun section of 1, you start to notice how wide the gulf between them is. Everything about the Machine Gun part is based around the drums, and for that double time main section, the lead guitar is firing away rapid tapping harmonies and very Satriani bends. It's awesome. But what makes it amazing is that when the drums go halftime for a breakdown or a snare volley, the solo follows suit. It's a small flourish, but it's those moments that make it sound unbelievably tight, which is exactly what you want for a section that's meant to sound like gunfire. And this level of precision with the solos is all over the album, from Black End to Shortest Straw, Frayed Ends. It's one thing to write a killer solo, but to write one that in sync with the rest of the band is something else. And it's another aspect that makes this album so special. Thanks, Kirk. But enough about Kirk, let's give Lars some love. The main riffs to the title track and one wouldn't be nearly as good as they are without his drumming, but his capacity to write unique drum parts is only half the picture. If every single drum part was some Neil Peart-esque prog breakdown, it would be exhausting, and if it was all just AC/DC drums, it would be boring. It's the blending of these two styles that elevates the album's drum work and allows these particularly long songs to feel fresh and dynamic despite that. Frayed Ends is one of my favorite examples. The song is a riff machine while still all being on one click aside from the intro, 96 BPM to 192. And it's the drums that allow the song to show many different flavors. The main riff has a drum pattern that's very slow and sparse, and it's mainly filled with, well, fills. It's this groovy feeling section that acts as the calm before the pre-chorus. But that same riff shows up again during the outro, and it maps so well onto the new double time drum section. And it's still groovy, but in a completely different way. It takes a lot more musical prowess to pull that off than just doing D beats but faster. I like that Metallica's ethos for pushing the envelope wasn't just make it faster and louder, it was make it more Metallica. And Frayed is just one example of drums giving new life to a riff on this album. One of the best in my opinion would be the outro harmony for the title track. I don't think it's a stretch to say that it's one of the best outros Metallica have ever written, period. And the AC/DC drums actually work best here by letting the harmony ride out to the end instead of jumping all over the place. And that harmony, oh my god, that harmony. Okay, when it comes to the harmonies on this album, all I can really say is they're amazing. Like, I can't add anything about what Metallica did differently from other bands or how they changed between this and Master of Puppets. It's just, they got better at writing harmonies. It's a testament to Cliff Burton's teaching skills and understanding of melodies that these parts are also good. It's nice that his work still ended up on the album, one way or another. But on the subject of Cliff's passing, I just want to clarify something from earlier. I don't want to imply that Cliff didn't have any effect on the making of Justice. Obviously, that's not true. But as I said, Justice likely would have sounded as intense as it is regardless of Cliff's fate, given the trajectory of thrash and statements by the band. I'm saying all this because I've been singing this album's praises for a while, and I don't want to feed into this idea that pain, loss, and addiction automatically lead to good music. It's a toxic and falsifiable mindset, and even if Justice's style can be better explained in other ways, it'll always dominate the conversation. That being said, there is one factor to Justice that can't be easily explained with musical trends alone, and that's a significant shift in mood, lyrics, and theme. Okay, well, it's not impossible to see how Metallica trended towards topical talking points through the twilight of their thrash tenure. You can even see it in their album covers. Kill 'Em All is blurry and vague with no obvious statements being made. Ride the Lightning has powerful imagery, but it's out of focus and easy to misconstrue.
Like, seriously, I can't be the only one who thought this electric chair was a microphone, right?
Master of Puppets has topical ideas front and center, but it's not the center of the album. It's a dark backdrop, a mood setter. With Justice, you can't possibly miss the political themes of the album. The cover is quite literally exposing justice to the viewer, so much that I'm not sure if I'm not going to need to blur this out or not. Because yes, Metallica had covered heavier topics on previous albums, but the way they were handled on Justice and the quantity of those ideas are very different. Take Ride the Lightning for an example. Awesome song, very underrated with a killer solo, extremely dark themes, but the way those themes are handled lyrically leaves a lot to be desired. It's very crass and unsubtle between the shrill yelling in the chorus and the deep, spooky voice in the background of the verse. It's one of Metallica's earlier attempts at heavier ideas, and you can tell. James would get better in this regard though, like on Disposable Heroes, where he doesn't feel the need to spell out the horror of war with goofy screaming or swearing like he did before. Just the way he sings "I Was Born for Dying" does more to illustrate the darkness of the song than anything on Ride the Lightning. It's far more in line with how war and death are treated on Justice. And on One, we see the final evolution of this subtler, more nuanced songwriting, beginning things somber while adding more horrific imagery as the character in the song becomes more aware of the hell that his life has become.
Taking my soul, left me with life in hell.
And yeah, it sure doesn't hurt that James's voice grew the beard on Justice, now a succulent baritone and finally coming into its own as Metallica's fifth instrument. So what changed? Well, obviously James's voice grew a bit deeper, but in lyrical terms, the darker elements spoke to something within James rather than something that sounded dark. Sure, there are some passages on this album that read as corny attempts at pathos, but other times, like, oh my god, James. And Justice for All's darkest moments, and frankly the darkest moments of Metallica's entire discography, come from James finding ways to express his deepest emotions through storycraft, and there hasn't been anything quite like it before or since. But of course, One has another important element that shows up all over And Justice for All, that being the more political elements. I don't know if I'd go as far as to say Justice is a concept album per se, in terms of consistent story or overarching themes, but at the very least it's high concept. The first half of the album is dedicated to issues of injustice, discrimination, censorship, and how the systems we have fail to protect us from devastation. The second half, starting with Harvester, is much more personal, grappling with ideas of insanity, grief, and generational trauma, capping that all off with a letter to James's parents on how they failed to prepare him for the modern world. Under this half-and-half framework, it can be seen as a concept album, just not one about politics specifically. The first half deals with societal failures at a systematic level, while the second half grapples with how systemic issues ruin people at a personal level. Considering what we learn about the world of Justice and the people in it, it's no surprise that James is angry near the end about not being ready to experience it. But that's a reach, I admit. The album is very much an anthology of these ideas in one package, but the fact that I can even make that reach in the first place says a lot about how focused the album is. It's a shame James didn't want Metallica to be labeled as a political band and did a lot to discredit that notion following Justice. Like seriously, every time he'd hold his middle finger up when singing One during their Attitude era during the late 90s,
I don't want to say cringe, but it's cringe.
I know he might reject that label, but honestly, if these songs were a sample of what's to come, I don't think they would have been too bad. I mean, they didn't handle these ideas perfectly, some of that crass songwriting slips through on occasion, but overall, they took it with a level of maturity better than the more political thrash bands of the time. I can't know for sure. Maybe they saw a future where they ended up as a burlesque political self-parody of themselves, but I wouldn't know anything about that. Hey, what are these Megadeth screenshots doing here? Alright, but seriously, since we're on the subject of flawed lyrics, we might as well move on to discussing the flaws of this album. Okay, I've put it off long enough, now we gotta talk about the mix. I like this album, but I'm not gonna sit here and lie to you that it has a great mix, but it's not that bad. At this point, the mix of Justice has been just as mythologized as its backstory, just as embellished and given the same lack of scrutiny. It's so overblown that some people have gone on to say that the mix should place it lower in rankings than Kill 'Em All and the Black Album. Now, I wouldn't have such an issue with people thinking this if Justice was even the worst mixed Metallica album to come out before or since, but it's not even close. Every bad mix has a story behind it. For Kill 'Em All, it was a case of inexperience. For Death Magnetic, it was a case of trusting Rick Rubin to be a good producer. And for Saint Anger, well, have you ever seen that episode of BoJack Horseman where he and Cuddly Whiskers come up with all these ideas for the BoJack Horseman show that sound cool and edgy when they first write them but end up just being cringy and embarrassing? That's Saint Anger, except instead it's James and Lars and their ideas are like, let's not have solos. Hey, let's replace the snare with a beer keg. Ooh, let's mix the vocals badly. Oh, let's have Kirk write some of the lyrics. Let's go downtune for no reason. Okay, point is, with all those other albums, you can understand that at a certain point, the band was like, it sounds bad, but we're too far gone at this point to change it. Justice is different though. It takes way less effort to turn up a bass mix than it takes to re-record every single drum track or fix a bunch of clipping, and obviously they wouldn't sabotage their album's sound just to get at their bassist. So at some point they listened to the record, thought it sounded fine, and sent it out. And if they couldn't tell at the booth that the album needed more time in the oven, can you really say that the album sounds worse than, say, a Death Magnetic or Saint Anger? I know the bass isn't the only mixing choice people have an issue with. Not everyone's a fan of the scoop guitar sound or the clicky drum sound, but those things are a lot more subjective takes compared to a literal missing bass. But okay, I've gone on defending this album's perceived flaws for a while, and I think I have to swallow my pride and admit that it's not perfect. The lacking bass really does work against some tracks like Beholder, the title track, Harvester of Sorrow, and Blackened, of course. And if you ask me, despite how much I love its more proggy elements, the absolute length of some of these songs can get to you, especially when you're actively listening. But saying that, I'd never go as far as to say the album itself is too long, and to prove it, here's a thought experiment. I've got two runtimes here. One is 65 minutes, the other is 80 minutes. One of these is the runtime for Saint Anger, the other is the runtime for Justice. Now you're a savvy viewer, and you understand what a framing device is, so you're probably expecting to be like, Justice is way more concise, despite having solos and harmonies, and it earns that 65-minute runtime, ho ho ho. Well, you're half right, Justice is 65 minutes long, and it does earn that runtime, but the thing is, I've lied to you, viewer, because that's not Saint Anger's runtime. It's close, but there's a Metallica album that's actually longer, somehow. Any guesses as to what it is? You're wrong. It's Load. Load is 80 minutes long. There hasn't been a Metallica album shorter than 70 minutes since 1991. Why? I've talked about why And Justice for All is an improvement on what came before, how it outperformed its contemporaries while standing out in its own right, but this right here is the core of why it remained a classic for this long. Why Metallica has repeatedly failed to recapture its magic time and time again. It's because Justice and all those other classic thrash albums knew when to land the plane. They didn't just have good songs, they were well structured. And that structure is another piece of why this album remains a classic. So what am I trying to say with all this? Have I just been talking your ear off about an album for half an hour?
Well, I mean, yeah.
But overall, I wanted to talk about it above all else, not just because it's good, not just because it's important to this channel, but because it's a perfect example of what metal can be when pushed to the limit. Metallica didn't get this big because they chased tropes. They got this big being themselves. Even in the scene of thrash advancement, this album is unmistakably Metallica. So make what you enjoy making, whatever that is. Whether or not you make mistakes, whether or not people gravitate to it, whatever you make, it is yours. This is Mawan, signing off. Oh, and if you like this, be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, and go to my Patreon. Haha, bye-bye.